Australia accomplished something most of the world couldn't. They looked one of the biggest, most powerful brands on earth square in the eye and, in no uncertain terms, told them to shove off. Back in the early 2000s, Starbucks rolled into Australia with all the swagger of a global conqueror. This was the company that had colonized the world, one cup at a time, and they assumed Australia would be just another easy market to dominate. But Aussie coffee drinkers met Starbucks with a brutal rejection. The brand's failure was so swift and so total it became a public humiliation, culminating in one of the most high-profile business flops in the country's history. Starbucks' aggressive 84-store expansion imploded, forcing the company to close 61 locations almost overnight. The collapse was so absolute that it became a global business punchline. Everyone thought that was the end of the story. Case closed. Australia wins. But it wasn't. Because while the world was busy laughing at them, the company didn't pack up and leave for good. It regrouped and completely changed its entire playbook, almost like it didn't want anyone to notice. And today, it's still here, still serving lattes, and it's even, very cautiously, expanding. So, how exactly is Starbucks, the brand that Australia famously destroyed, still standing? Well, let's break it down. To understand why Starbucks flopped so hard, you have to grasp one critical, non-negotiable fact. Australia never needed Starbucks, not even a little bit. In the United States, Starbucks essentially created the modern cafe scene. Before them, coffee, for most of America, was a burnt pot of drip filter sludge at a diner, so when Starbucks introduced espresso to the masses, they were the upgrade. But in Australia, they were a massive, almost insulting downgrade. Australia's love affair with real coffee was already decades old, deeply rooted in the national culture. This passion was a direct result of the post-World War II migration waves, which brought tens of thousands of Italian and Greek families to cities like Melbourne and Sydney. With them came their vibrant cultures, which included coffee. Long before Starbucks ever even dreamed of a third-place concept, CBDs in Melbourne and Sydney were buzzing with independent cafes. People would sit down, read the paper, argue about politics, and have a proper chat. The coffee was prepared by professional baristas, often the owners themselves, who developed a deep familiarity with their regulars and knew them by name and by order. By the time Starbucks finally showed up in Sydney in the year 2000, Australia already had one of the most sophisticated, competitive, and mature coffee markets on the planet. Local cafes were everywhere, and they were exceptionally good too. These baristas knew how to pull a real espresso shot, understanding extraction times and grind consistency. They knew how to froth milk into perfect silky microfoam for the flat white, a drink they had perfected decades earlier, not the bubby, scalded mess Starbucks was famous for. Aussies didn't want coffee-flavored milkshakes. They didn't want to drown a perfectly good espresso in half a liter of milk, caramel syrup, whipped cream, and chocolate sprinkles. They wanted coffee. So when Starbucks rolled in, Australians were genuinely confused by the whole proposition. The menu was a mess of awkward Americanisms. Tall meant small. Venti meant what exactly? And why did everything taste like burnt beans and dessert? The coffee itself was roasted so dark and so aggressively that it tasted charred to the Australian palate, which was already accustomed to more nuanced, locally roasted beans. This created a full-on culture clash. Starbucks was trying to sell a sugary, mass-produced commodity to a country already enjoying a handcrafted artisanal product. The brand's arrival was completely out of step with the market. It was like showing up to a 5-star dinner party with a bag of cheap burgers. Starbucks was riding high on 2 decades of unstoppable growth. It had conquered America, it had conquered Europe, and it had conquered Asia. How could a small island continent of 20-odd million people be any different? They treated Australia like any other market to be dominated, launching with a strategy of pure brute force expansion, assuming that if they built it, the customers would come. Between 2000 and 2008, the company opened an astonishing 84 stores. That's a new store opening every single month for 8 straight years, in a market that was clearly not interested. Their aggressive expansion strategy went far beyond the obvious tourist traps in Sydney. They pushed into Melbourne, the undisputed capital of Australian coffee snobbery, in a move that locals saw as incredibly arrogant. They also opened stores in Brisbane, in Perth, and in smaller suburban areas that had absolutely no demand for what they were selling. And at every single step, they refused to adapt. The menus stayed stubbornly American, prioritizing frappuccinos and syrupy lattes. The store designs were the same generic cookie-cutter layouts you'd find in Ohio or Seattle, lacking any local character. Worst of all, the prices were shockingly high, often significantly more expensive than the superior tasting flat white you could get from the independent cafe right next door. Naturally, curious Aussies tried it once and maybe a second time just to be sure. They'd walk in, scan the confusing menu, order a grande something, take one sip of the overly sweet, burnt-tasting liquid, and think, right, that's that then. And they never came back. They just returned to their local neighborhood spot where the barista knew their name, the espresso tasted like coffee, and the vibe felt authentic. For 8 years, Starbucks hemorrhaged money. The brand became a national joke. By 2008, Starbucks Australia had racked up over $140 million in losses. And then, the 2008 global financial crisis hit, and corporate headquarters in Seattle suddenly needed to trim the fat and cut costs. Fast. Australia was the first, most obvious head on the chopping block. It was the perfect corporate cover to exit a market they had comprehensively failed to understand. In July 2008, Starbucks announced that they were closing 61 of their 84 stores, pulling out of entire cities like Perth and Adelaide, and laying off nearly 700 employees. It was one of the most spectacular, high-profile corporate failures in Australian history. The message couldn't have been clearer. Australia had rejected Starbucks hard. After the 2008 collapse, most people just assumed Starbucks was done. The remaining 23 stores felt like a token presence, a leftover embarrassment that eventually clean up and quietly shutter. For a few years, that's exactly what it looked like. The brand went completely silent. But then, in 2014, something interesting happened. A quiet move made behind the scenes that changed the entire game. Starbucks Australia was sold. It was bought by the Withers Group, a private family-owned Australian company. Now, you might not know that name, but you absolutely know their flagship business. They were the licensed operators of 7-Eleven in Australia. This single acquisition is the absolute key to understanding their survival. Starbucks would no longer be run by corporate HQ in Seattle, which had proven it didn't understand the market. It was handing the keys to a local operator. And keep in mind, this wasn't just any operator, but one that is the undisputed master of Australian convenience retail. The Withers Group's expertise and their entire business model is built on the mastery of location. They know how to secure high foot traffic, quick in and out sites better than anyone. They live and breathe the right place, right time model of retail. With that single move, Starbucks' strategy in Australia flipped 180 degrees. They officially and permanently gave up on trying to win over Australians. The new plan shifted entirely to a location-first strategy. The Withers Group applied their 7-Eleven playbook directly to Starbucks, targeting transport hubs, suburban shopping strips, and service stations. Expansion continued, but it became slow, methodical, and incredibly specific, focusing only on these high-traffic, convenience-oriented sites. These strategic sites included tourist-heavy areas like Sydney's Darling Harbour and Queensland's Gold Coast, major transport hubs, and zones right near university campuses. The company was now focused on serving a pre-existing customer base, making a subtle, humble shift in its entire mission. This change marked the beginning of Starbucks' new life as a quiet, niche survivor in the Australian market. So, where does that leave Starbucks now? As of mid-2024, there are roughly 70 Starbucks locations in all of Australia. To truly understand what a small footprint this is, we need to put that number in perspective. The United States has over 16,000 stores. New York City alone has almost 200 stores. Australia, a continent-sized nation of nearly 27 million people, has 72. This tiny number of locations means Starbucks is a mere footnote in the Australian market. For stark local context, the homegrown Australian chain The Coffee Club has over 300 stores, while Gloria Jean's has hundreds more. Starbucks is clearly a very small player in this environment. The company's strategy becomes even clearer when you look at where those 70-odd stores are. Almost all of them are clustered in the three major eastern states, New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland. Starbucks' presence in Australia is sparse and highly concentrated, a clear sign of the brand's deliberate caution. This approach is a direct result of being burned so badly and so publicly in the past, and they have no desire for a repeat. In most of the country, drinking Starbucks is seen as a bit basic. It's not just the coffee isn't up to standard, it's that the brand itself is seen as foreign, generic, and totally lacking in personality. Choosing Starbucks in Australia is seen by locals as the cultural equivalent of going to Naples and insisting on eating at Pizza Hut. It's technically food, but you're completely, fundamentally missing the point of being there. Even today, Starbucks isn't part of the real Australian coffee conversation. It's not the place locals go to meet friends, talk shop, or start their morning. That sacred role still belongs, and probably always will, to the independent cafe on the corner. But here's the critical part. Starbucks isn't pretending to be that anymore. It's accepted its role. Starbucks isn't really selling coffee anymore, it's selling Starbucks drinks. It's a different category, one that's closer to a dessert, a milkshake, or a bubble tea than it is to a flat white. It's found a lane, and it's quietly staying in it. Starbucks' survival in Australia has almost nothing to do with local coffee drinkers, but it has everything to do with global familiarity. Australia receives millions of international tourists every single year. On top of that, it hosts over 600,000 international students, a massive population that brings billions into the economy. And where do a huge number of these students and tourists come from? Well, they tend to come from countries in Asia like China, South Korea, Japan, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines. In those countries, Starbucks is a premium, high-status, desirable brand. It's a symbol of Western aspiration and a familiar daily ritual. These students and tourists, along with visitors from the United States that land in a new, unfamiliar country, the green mermaid logo acts as a beacon of comfort. It's familiar, safe, and predictable. You can walk in, order your go-to drink, the one you get every day back home, and it will taste like it does back home. In a new country, that becomes a small, reliable piece of home. And Starbucks, now under the guidance of the ex-7-Eleven operators, knows this. Their entire strategy is built on it. Those store locations near tourist hubs and university campuses is the whole plan. It's about catering to a built-in audience of people who already want Starbucks instead of burning millions trying to convert the millions of people who will never want it. That, in a nutshell, is why the brand still exists in Australia today. It's a business built for tourists and students, run by a company that mastered convenience. Starbucks entered Australia with a staggering level of corporate arrogance. It assumed it could just copy and paste its American model onto a market that was already demonstrably superior and that people would just buy it. That arrogance cost them over $100 million and handed them their single greatest international failure. But what happened next was rare and, you have to admit, kind of smart. Starbucks adapted to the market slowly and with way less noise. they pivoted their entire strategy to avoid direct competition with Aussie cafes, a game they were never equipped to play. By carving out their own niche, they effectively moved to a different stadium where they could be the only team playing. This brings us to the big question. Is this all just phase 1? Is Starbucks just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to take another big shot at conquering Australia? For a long time, the answer seemed to be a definitive no. But in 2024, the story added a new, unexpected chapter. After more than a decade of completely abandoning Western Australia, Starbucks announced it was coming back to Perth. This new push into Perth is a slow, cautious Withers Group style infiltration. The plan involves an initial 12 stores with more in the pipeline for 2025. These new stores are strategically placed in suburban areas as drive-through locations. This approach is purely focused on targeting convenience. It shows that the Withers Group is content to run the now profitable brand as a niche, slowly growing chain. The existing 70-odd stores are already doing solid, reliable business with their target demographic, allowing the brand to get exposure without sparking backlash. So, could they grow to 100 stores? Maybe 150? Possibly over the next decade, but 500? 1,000? Not a chance. The Australian coffee scene is even more competitive today than it was in 2000. The rise of third wave and specialty coffee has raised the bar even higher. Australians are now talking about single origin beans, pour over methods, and cold brew nitro. Starbucks can't compete on quality, on price, and on authenticity. It has no weapons to fight that war, and it finally knows it. It's so easy to look at a Goliath like Starbucks, a brand with tens of thousands of stores and billions in revenue, and assume it's invincible. But Australia proves that that's not true. It proves that a strong, passionate, and established local culture can, in fact, beat a global corporation. Ultimately, this story is one of survival. Starbucks' success in Australia is measured by the simple fact that it's still there at all. After getting knocked down and humiliated, the brand got back up and found a way to simply exist in the margins. In a country where coffee culture runs deeper than any franchise or frappuccino, that might just be the smartest move they've ever made. So, what do you think? Is Starbucks playing smart in Australia, or are they just a zombie brand clinging to life support? Would you ever choose Starbucks over your local cafe? Or is this one of those rare, beautiful cases where the little guys actually won and kept on winning? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the business, culture, and weird economics behind the brands you thought you knew. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.